Reining in the armed groups in Iraq. The Prime Minister is under pressure to deal with pro-Iran militias. Recent attacks are putting Mustafa al-Kadhimi's leadership to the test. Is he capable of confronting the problem? And how much of a threat do these groups pose? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Since taking office in May, Iraq's Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi has been tackling a number of international and domestic challenges. However, his main policy has been to reduce the stranglehold Iran-backed militias have had on large parts of the country's security forces since the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. But al-Kadhimi's ability to succeed is being questioned. On December 20th, at least 8 rockets struck Baghdad's heavily fortified green zone. 1 worker was wounded, and a residential complex and cars were damaged. The arrest of a senior leader in Qais Khazali's Asaib al-Haq militia for his involvement in the attack has opened up the possibility of a confrontation between the government and armed groups. Meanwhile, tensions are escalating between the United States and Iran. U.S. President Donald Trump blamed Iran for the Baghdad attack and threatened to respond militarily. The claim was dismissed by the new chief of Tehran's elite Quds force, part of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, on a recent visit to the Iraqi capital. Ismail Qaani replaced Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated in a U.S. drone strike in January. The White House is now concerned about what Iranian-backed forces in Iraq might do ahead of the anniversary of Soleimani's death. We'll discuss this shortly with our guests, but first let's take a closer look at the main Iran-backed militias in Iraq. The Popular Mobilization Forces was formed in 2014 after a call from leading Shia cleric Ali Sistani for Iraqis to join the fight against ISIL. Its members are mostly Shia Muslims, and many of them are supported by Iran's government. Kataib Hezbollah was set up in 2003, just before the invasion of Iraq by the U.S. and its allies. During the war, it carried out many attacks against American and coalition forces and has long-standing ties with Tehran. Qais al-Khazali, who is on a U.S. terror list, heads the Iranian-backed Shia militia as Asaib al-Haq. His forces fought in Syria alongside President Bashar al-Assad's troops. All right, let's bring in our guests. Michael Pregent is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former advisor to Iraqi security forces. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And in Tehran, we have Ali Akbar Dareini, a researcher at the Center for Strategic Studies. Welcome to each of you. Michael, let me start with you today. Just how precarious is the position that Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi finds himself in right now? And is he going to be able to confront those Iran-backed armed groups in the country?
Well, thanks for having me. It's a difficult position for anyone who becomes prime minister to go after these militia members when the militia members themselves wear the uniform of the Iraqi military. So in several cases, Prime Minister Kadhimi has put counterterrorism forces at risk by having them capture militia members only to release them within 24 to 72 hours. After Kadhimi is pressured by members of the militias, to include Abu Fadak of Kitab Hezbollah, Qais Khazali of Asaib al-Haq. So it's a very sad state for Iraq when the prime minister cannot use the Iraqi security forces because they're infiltrated by these militias to go after militia members responsible for rocket attacks against the U.S. mission in Iraq. That not only hurt Americans, they also kill Iraqis. So it's a very difficult situation for the U.S. to continue to say that it has a partner in Baghdad.
Ali, from your vantage point in Tehran, how difficult does the situation look for the Iraqi Prime Minister right now?
Prime Minister al-Kadhimi is finding himself in a difficult position. He has to play a very delicate role. On one side, he has to deal with the United States. On the other side, there is growing public opposition to U.S. troops in Iraq. The Iraqi parliament has already called on U.S. troops to leave the country. So he is trying to play a delicate role at the same time. As far as Iran is concerned, Iran has made it very clear when in recent days The Iraqi Prime Minister's advisor visited Tehran. Iran's message to him was very clear. Iran is not seeking to create tensions in the region and supports the Iraqi Prime Minister's call that there is no room for adventurism.
Michael, where does Iraq's relationship stand right now when it comes to the U.S.?
Well, right now, Baghdad has a very tenuous relationship with the United States, and 80% of Iraqis want a better relationship with the United States. And they say things like Iraq Hura, Iran Bara, which means Iraq is free and Iran stop interfering, meaning get out. So right now, it's unfortunate because the incoming administration is not going to take these militias seriously. And they're going to likely try to re-engage with the Iran deal, which will only embolden the militias and embolden Iran's malign behavior. So this is that moment between an election and a change in the U.S. administration in D.C., where our adversaries and geopolitical foes take advantage of this space by positioning chess pieces on the chessboard, ready to do something after January 20th. And that's where we find ourselves in Iraq. The militias are testing U.S. resolve with these rocket attacks. Iran is encouraging these attacks. Iran is funding, training, and equipping these militias. And these militias are working on behalf of what is called the Vilayat al-Faqih, the revolution tied to the Islamic Republic in Iran. And the United States needs to be aware of that. I mean, we're supposed to be fighting ISIS and destroying ISIS in Iraq, yet the biggest threat in Iraq is not from ISIS. It's from these militias tied to Tehran. And I do believe the United States will conduct some strikes against militia leaders ahead of January 20th, based on the rhetoric and based on the fact that it'll just give a Biden team more leverage inside of Iraq and in dealing with Iran to target some of these leaders that are not only killing Iraqis, but are threatening the U.S. and NATO mission in Iraq.
Ali, I saw you shaking your head in response to some of what Michael was saying in his past answer. Did you want to add to it?
The Trump administration is deliberately escalating tensions in the region, including with Iran, and just to intimidate Iran and Iraqi groups. But this is a symptom. The real reason, the root cause of the current situation is the fact that the Trump administration has failed on his goals in the past 4 years. When he pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, he stated 4 goals. First, it was to get Iran to renegotiate the nuclear deal on his terms. Second, it was to get Iran agree to a better deal that will eliminate Iran's uranium enrichment program, limit Iran's missile program, and the fourth was to limit or restrict Iran's regional influence. Has he succeeded in achieving any of those goals? No. Now he is leaving the White House in 3 weeks' time, battered and broken, without achieving any of those goals. So it's not surprising that the Trump administration is increasing tensions. But Iran has been following a policy of restraint towards the United States. Iran does know that the Trump administration is not happy with the expectation that the incoming Biden administration will rejoin the JCPOA. And Iran wants to give the Biden administration an opportunity to return to the nuclear deal and lift the sanctions and undo what the damages that the Trump administration has done. So it is the United States that is seeking tensions with Israel and Saudi Arabia, even provoking the U.S. to instigate chaos and tensions in this region.
Michael, it looked to me like you may have wanted to jump in. Before you do, I also want to ask you, when it comes down to the possibility of re-entering negotiations between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear deal, if that were to occur with the incoming Biden administration, putting aside what that does when it comes to Iran, how does that affect Iraq?
Well, Iran has used Iraq to offset U.S. sanctions. It's never been more clear. The Islamic Republic of Iran has primacy in Iraq. They decide the prime minister. They have influence within the security and intelligence apparatus. They have penetrated all of Iraq's economic sectors. So going back into the Iran deal will only encourage that kind of behavior, and lifting sanctions is the last thing we want to do. This has actually given the Biden administration leverage in renegotiating an Iran deal. But what I would say is there's no appetite in Washington, D.C. to lift sanctions on this regime. There's no appetite in Washington, D.C. to join back into the Iran deal without addressing ballistic missiles, sunset clauses, inspections of sites that have been carved out of the JCPOA, and of course, regional behavior. And if you listen to the regime's rhetoric, if the regime caved on any of those demands, meaning ballistic missiles, sunset clauses, and regional behavior, it would actually collapse the regime. If the regime decided that the hijab was optional, it would collapse the regime. That's how weak this regime is, and that's how effective the maximum pressure campaign has actually been on the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Ali, let me ask you, also from your perspective, do you think that some sort of a clash between Iraq's government and those Iran-backed paramilitary groups is inevitable at this stage?
First of all, we have to differentiate between the popular mobilization forces known as Hashd al-Sha'bi and many numerous groups that are unknown or newly formed groups who are operating independently. It's very unrealistic and naive to attribute anything Iraqi groups do to Iran simply because Iran, they do not take advice from Iran. But in recent weeks, we have seen the emergence of new groups with no clear affiliations. But as far as the popular mobilization forces or Hashd al-Sha'bi is concerned, Iran has encouraged them to not to give the United States a pretext to escalate tensions. Iran has condemned attacks on the U.S. embassy because it does not approve attacks on diplomatic compounds. But military installations or military bases is totally a different story. So I believe that the popular mobilization forces have no inclination to escalate tensions, but it is the U.S. that is looking for such an excuse, and there are unknown groups that may do that. But at the same time, we have to be careful about the very explosive situation. You are dealing with an unpredictable president in the White House, an unconventional president who may take decisions out of a sudden without consultation with his advisors, and you have strong lobby groups from Israel and Saudi Arabia who are provoking the United States to seek tensions. It's very ironic that President Trump, who was elected in 2017 on the platform of ending wars in the Middle East, is now escalating tensions and even looking for war in the final days of his administration.
Michael, looked to me like you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So these new militias that our guest in Tehran is talking about were created by the IRGC Quds Force, were created by Ismail Qani. The members that make up these new groups are from Kitab Hezbollah, a militia tied to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They come from Asaib al-Haq, another militia tied to Tehran. And the thinking in Tehran is if these groups aren't designated, then the U.S. cannot attack them. And they have to stop thinking that way. The U.S. will defend itself. The U.S. will defend itself in a proactive way as well. If the United States sees an imminent attack, it'll do something. But here's the problem. It's the Baghdad government that denies its airspace to U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets at the request of militia leaders like Hadi al-Amri. and Abu Fadak of Kitab Hezbollah. It is Nasrallah who said this week that the Hashd al-Shabi are tied directly to the IRGC Quds Force, that they are trained, equipped, and funded by Iran. And this is the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah saying this. So these militias are directly tied to Iran, and Qasem Soleimani's one-year anniversary of his death is coming up, and they are testing U.S. resolve ahead of that day. That's why we had the rocket attacks last week, and we expect more, and the United States is ready for that. And there's a target packet on Qais Khazali, on Abu Fadak, on 55 sites inside of Iran tied to the IRGC, and the Iranian people are okay with the IRGC being targeted as long as the U.S. doesn't target civilians. That's how unpopular this regime is in Iran. That's how unpopular the IRGC and its Quds Force are in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen.
Ali, as you heard Michael mention, it's almost a year to the day since the killing of Qasem Soleimani. What's the view from Tehran on this? Is it expected that there will be more tensions in the days leading up to the anniversary, that there will be more attacks?
From the Iranian point of view, Iran slapped the United States in the face immediately after the Trump administration ordered General Soleimani's assassination, and that was launching missiles into al-Assad airbase. But that was the beginning, not the end. Iran has vowed to take revenge and punish all those responsible for this brutal assassination in breach of international law, including Trump himself. But Iran has plenty of time to do so, and it has no intention to provide an excuse for a battered and broken Trump to create tensions now. This is the Iranian viewpoint. But what the Iraqi groups are going to do is their own decision. That's the problem. General Soleimani had influence over these groups. And the United States targeted the head of rationality. And now Iraqi groups have been wounded. Their leaders have been killed on their own soil. How do you expect them, what do you expect them to do? The United States has killed their leaders, and they have every right to take revenge. But Iran is encouraging them not to do so, at least now, if they want to take such a revenge. So, but it doesn't mean that they, all of them listen to Iran. They do not take advice from Iran. But as far as, you know, I expect that the popular mobilization forces are not going to engage in escalation unless there are unknown groups without a clear affiliation to do so in the day, at least until January 20th, when Trump leaves the White House.
Michael, I'm going to let you make your point in just a second, but I also want to ask you, where are things right now when it comes to U.S. presence in Iraq, when it comes to U.S. troops going forward, when it comes to diplomatic staff going forward? What's going to happen?
Well, two things are going to happen. I mean, if Iraq continues down this path, I mean, we're looking at an election in 2021, one where former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki believes he can be prime minister. And he had to step down in 2014 as a precondition for the United States to provide air support to Iraqi security forces to take on ISIS. Maliki had to step down. He thinks he can win the premiership in 2021. If he does, the United States should just stop all engagement inside of Iraq, admit that Iraq was a failure, start punishing Baghdad and its economic sectors tied to Tehran, continue the maximum pressure campaign. Now, I'm saying all of this, but a Biden administration isn't going to do any of that. The Biden administration is going to act like everything's okay inside of Iraq, allow the militias to grow primacy, probably even support Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, re-engage with the Iran deal, lift sanctions, and for the next 4 years, Ismail Khani, Tehran, and these militias are going to be able to do whatever they want until the Iraqi people inside of Iraq say enough, and the Iranian people have already said enough inside of Iran. Regimes collapse on their own. The U.S. can't accelerate a collapse of a regime. It's always the people. And within the poetry in Iraq and the poetry inside of Iran and the music in Iraq and Iran, you see the beginnings of that collapse. Those are the same things that happened with the fall of the Soviet Union. It began in music, it began in poetry, and we're already seeing it there. The next 4 years, under a Biden administration, the regime will likely collapse on its own.
Ali, when it comes to Shia clerics, religious leaders in Iraq, ones who have strong ties with Iran, where is their support going to right now? Are they supporting the Prime Minister in this confrontation? What's happening with them?
They do, but the point is that the Iraqi Prime Minister wants to have the backing of the United States at the same time while trying to, appease its own population. And he finds it very difficult to do so because these two cannot go together.
Its population is not pro-Iran. Population is anti-Iran. Just, a few months back, there was a call for demonstrations, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis took to the streets denouncing the U.S. Deployment, U.S. military presence in Iraq. These are the facts, not the other. If you call on the Iraqis to take to the streets today, you will see that they don't want U.S. troops on their soil because they remember that the boots of the U.S. troops on their carpets. They do not forget that Blackwater committed crimes against Iraqi civilians, and now Donald Trump pardons those killers, those murderers. So it's not difficult to imagine how the Iraqi people will react to that. But let me point to another key issue. What is the root cause of all this? The United States is following the doctrine of the Cold War and this towards Iran. The neoconservatives in the United States have been looking for an enemy. And they find Iran as a replacement for the Soviet Union. The U.S. policy has been one of containment of Iran. And this policy of containment sometimes has got close to regime change.
Ali, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We only have about a minute and a half left. I saw that Michael also wanted to jump in, so I'm going to give you the last word here. Please go ahead.
Sure. The Iraqi people, 80% of the population is under the age of 30. And this is the first time the Shia population in Iraq, which makes up 60% of Iraq's population, has said no to Iran, has told the Americans, yes, you've made mistakes, but this is how to get it right. I'm not encouraging U.S. boots on the ground. I'm talking about a relationship with the West, one that is built in education, in finance, in military support, but not boots on the ground necessarily, but an ally that can rejoin the Middle East and not be a puppet state of Tehran. So it's the Iraqi people that are saying no to Kadhimi, support the U.S., get away from Iran. And it's the militias that have Kadhimi so afraid that he releases them after he captures them. There's too much control. The members of the parliament are in militia hands. The COR, al-Bana'a, is tied to Maliki. It's basically militiamen in suits deciding what Iraq's future should be when the population wants a different outcome in 2021 elections. So the Iraqi people have to help themselves. The Biden administration will not, unfortunately.
All right, we've run out of time. We're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks to our guests, Michael Pregent and Ali Akbar Dareini. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.